the whispering of a brook. Think what you'll discover when you take a closer look.
The Cherokee people believe that everything is connected. Everything that is living is part of the great cycle, and we as people, human beings, are part of that great cycle also. We believe that plants are our special friends, and that harmony in our relationships with plants and all other parts of the land promotes our well-being and the well-being of the earth. The land of the Cherokee before the time of European settlers included the southern Appalachians from what is now Georgia to West Virginia. This is a land of great beauty, majestic mountains, fertile valleys with graceful rivers, lush forests filled with many different plants and animals, cool mountain streams, and high mountain balds. Every part of this land and all living things are sacred to the Cherokee, for the Cherokee understand that they are connected to this land. Only by taking care of it, as the land takes care of them, can the people live well. Understanding. All of life is woven into an intricate web that includes all people, all animals, all plants, and the land itself. The Cherokee believe that plants have a spirit, and it is through the spirit that people can know the plant and can understand how it might be used. The Cherokee respect all living organisms and always give thanks for what these plants provide to the people. The Cherokee were great observers. Long before Europeans explored this land, every plant had a Cherokee name, and its name describes something about the plant. Mistletoe, which gets its nutrition from the trees it lives on, is called Udasli, or it is married. The black-eyed Susan is called Akta, or deer eye. Mayapple, with its broad umbrella leaf hiding the large white flower underneath, is called Unishquetusti, or it wears a hat. Some plants are named for how animals use them. The wild rose is Zist unigisti. The rabbit eats it. Shield fern is called Yon Udzestone. The bear lies on it. Over 800 different kinds of plants have been used by the Cherokee for hundreds of years for food, clothing, shelter, or medicine. Even today, many of these uses survive through traditions which are kept alive by the stories passed on to children and grandchildren. Plants play important and varied roles in these stories. Freeman Owl, Cherokee storyteller, tells many stories about plants, including the Cherokee myths, old stories about the beginnings or origin of things. These myths have been told by Cherokee storytellers for hundreds of years. Listen to these parts of two old myths told by Freeman Owl, the origin of strawberries and the origin of medicine.
The first man and first woman lived together peacefully and happily until one day they began to quarrel. And the woman took off very angry until suddenly she saw in front of her a patch of large ripe strawberries. And she sat down right in the middle of the patch. She began to eat. As she did, she thought of her husband. And she soon picked a great, large handful of strawberries. And when he met her, she accepted him kindly, and they went back home together. And so were the first strawberries. In the old days, the beasts, the birds, the fishes, the insects, and the plants could all talk. And they lived together with the people in peace and friendship. But as time went on, the people increased so rapidly that the poor animals found themselves beginning to be cramped for room. Man began to slaughter the animals. The animals decided to begin war against man. The deer decided to send rheumatism to every hunter. The fishes and reptiles decided to make man dream. The birds, insects, and other small animals created many new diseases. The plants, who were friendly to man, heard what had been done by the animals and agreed to furnish man with a cure for each of the diseases. Thus came medicine.
Many plants are used as medicines by the Cherokee. They believe that medicine brings a person back into balance with the world. They believe there is a spirit connecting all things, and they understand, therefore, that it is through their spirit as well as their mind that they know how to use plants to bring back balance. When a plant is taken from the forest for medicine, a gift is left in its place, and the first plant is not taken, but 4 plants are found before one is gathered. Many parts of the plant are used for medicine. Sometimes the tea is made from the leaves, the root, or the bark, or perhaps the flowers or fruit, and drunk as a tonic, a drink which keeps one healthy. It may lower a fever or help with a stomach ache. Parts of a plant may be crushed to make a poultice, a sort of paste that can be placed on the body to help heal wounds. Or a plant might be burned for the healing smoke, or boiled for the healing steam. There are many ways to bring a person into balance with the world.
I remember one time that my aunt asked me to go with her to gather some medicine for a sick person, and I went with her. And on the way to the hillside, she explained to me what kind of a plant we were looking for. I knew the plant well. When we came to the woods, I saw a lot of plants that she had described to me, and I knew that was the plant. And I said, "There's one." And she came over, and she looked at it, and she said, "No, that's not the one." Yet I knew and realized that that was the plant she had described to me. So I didn't say anything. I just kept on going with her, knowing that she had something else that I needed to learn. And maybe it was because she wanted me to learn. This is the reason she took me along with her that day. I realized that later. And when we were along the hillside, I saw many, many plants like the one that she had described to me, and each time she told me, "No, that's not the one." And then after a while she said, "Bob, come up here. There's the plant." And it was the same species of plant that I had been showing to her. And this particular plant was shaking in the wind and in the breeze, and there was no breeze. That plant was trembling. And she said, "We have to be sure. We have to be sure because a sick person is depending on us." And so she said, "Let's take it down to the creek." And we took off the hillside down to the creek. And she took that root and washed the dirt off of it. And then she put it in the palm of her hand and stood there just a minute or so. And without any encouragement, the root turned over in her hand. And she said, "That's it. That's it." And then she took that root back to the medicine man.
All right, I'll leave this space for you.
Did you mic yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
Works.
It's working. Okay. It's working. Welcome to all of you this morning. My name is Kathy Monholland. This is my sort of baby, and I am terribly happy to see all of you. Welcome to all of you. I feel like we have a stellar cast lined up to speak with you. Clint Carroll, whom you've seen up here getting his presentation ready to go, will be our first keynote speaker. What we know about things that grow in the wild, Cherokee environmental knowledge over time. Tony and Kara Harris, most of you saw as you came in, they will be talking this afternoon about if plants could talk. Tony's going to tell us what they would tell us. And then Kara is going to tell us how to set up our own Cherokee garden. They brought plants and books. The plants will be given as door prizes. We have several copies of the video that you've been watching this morning that we will also share with you as door prizes. So please come back this afternoon if you're able to at all. I teach the history class here. I also do history tours and history talks. This is one of the few annual events that I do. We did it last year. It was a big hit, and I'm very happy to see that it's doubled in size from last year. And next year, I hope I have to move it to the ballroom. I hope we have people hanging off the rafters. So welcome to all of you. Our Deputy Chief Joe Crittenden has a few welcoming remarks to make, and then we will have a blessing by Dennis Sixkiller, and then we will actually begin the conference. So, Joe, if you'd come down. If you would, please welcome Deputy Chief Joe Crittenden.
Good morning. Great group this morning. Kathy came over just a little bit ago and apologized, I guess, for I didn't know you were having this meeting this morning, and she asked me if I'd like to come over and say a few words, and I said, Kathy, I haven't got anything prepared, and she said, well, just tell them you're welcome, and we're glad you're here, and pay attention and learn something. And that's not a bad plan. I grew up in the woods. I care about our plants. I care about our foods that's out there, the medicine and all of that. Unfortunately, my great-grandmother, was the one I went to with questions and concerns. I could bring in a snapping turtle and some kind of berries or whatever, and she would not only, it's hard to get anything cooked anymore when you bring it in from the woods. Granny would not only cook it, but she'd clean it and not gripe. Love my elders, but anyhow, has anybody been in the woods harvesting huckleberries? Melvina has, I know. Robert, my grandsons went out, my grandsons went out 2 different days and have actually picked over 2 gallons of huckleberries. That's a lot of little bitty huckleberries. I have some concerns about someone said something about our plants talking and stuff. You know, I think some of our environment out there talks to us, not in our audible voice that we hear, but in the way that they survive or they don't survive. I can remember a time when there was chinky-pin trees all over the place over in Adair County, and it was part of a chestnut tree family, and a black came through and killed them. There's something going on right now in our red oak timber, our oak timber, and I'm concerned about that. I can remember going through the woods and we'd take an 8-pound lard bucket and a tow sack and a gig and a .22 rifle, and we'd head for the creek and we'd gather our food for the day. Whether it was gooseberries. Anybody ever eat any gooseberry pie? We used to find those out there in the woods, but I haven't found a gooseberry in forever. I don't know if something killed them too. And what does that say about our environment when those kind of things happen to our trees and our plants? Something's out of balance. Something ain't like it ought to be. Country boy talk. And what's that doing to the human species or us? I mean, could be. But anyhow, that's just some of the things I throwed in, Kathy. I didn't mean to get off and chase a rabbit, but if anybody in this, there's a lot of intelligent folks here, and I know a lot of you like morel mushrooms, and if we could somehow figure out how to make them and grow them commercially, you talk about a golden goose. That would be wonderful. So if you all come up with that, let's grow them here in Cherokee country. But anyhow, welcome, and I wish I wasn't already booked for some things. I'd kind of like to sit in on this because I really care about our woods and what's out there, our environment. Thank you for coming, and I hope your day is well spent and you learn a lot of things today. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Chief Crittenden. Dennis Sixkiller will now give us a blessing before we get going with our conference. Dennis?
Glory to God. Hello, everybody. Will you stand with me, please? Let's pray. We do the girly hands good. I will tell you, Jesus, go you. Cosine is other say, no, we go or the young hand. I let the new one is. He's daily scarce go here. You other we send the God and you one is. Let's go here. In the again, eh? Not. To the no hair. You got, I guess, I worship it on no hand. Tao care shoes no word guess. I use can eat us get, in the again, not. Send not here. To the new one is. You thought the day for let's go or the haste. So I say. In the year hands against her, I would do yacht or the hand. I mean, yes, God, do not ask you to let us and you no cares. Use can eat us get, says you, cheese yarn, yes, cheese get your hug, you get that, they're not in the game. That's where the God on like this, and eh, good, they steady skate over here. Excuse or detail for shy, cheese to run, you got all these guy. Amen.
Amen.
Now I'm going to introduce Pat Gwynn to you. Pat has worked with Clint over the years, and he is going to introduce our keynote guest speaker. Pat? Pat is with our Natural Resources Department.
Yes, and on behalf of the Natural Resources Department, welcome you all to the Cherokee Nation. Appreciate you coming. And just so you can be rest assured, I'm not part of the stellar lineup that Ms. Monholland was referring to earlier. Kathy also asked me to give just a very quick briefing on tomorrow. Tomorrow there's going to be a field trip, which Kathy has arranged transportation. I'm sure she'll be talking about it more, but she wanted me to make sure that for those that were going, just to let you know that this is a field trip, which means it's a trip out in the field. We're not going to a park. We're actually going to the woods. There's ticks, there's chiggers, there's snakes, there's blackberries and things like that. So please dress accordingly. And regardless of what some of you might think, not everybody who gets bit by a tick or chigger will die. Just some of them do. So, and we haven't had any casualties over the last year. So, all kidding aside, it will be a good trip tomorrow. It will be a chance to go out where we should all spend more time. We'll see 40 or 50 very interesting plants, which Mother Nature's not treating really well this year, but the plants are tougher than we are. So, my main reason here today is to introduce. I guess he is the keynote speaker, but I actually refer to him as my friend, and I don't refer to very many people as friends, and that's vice versa, I might add. Mr. Clint Carroll, I met Mr. Carroll about 10 years ago, and pardon me, I believe he's actually Dr. Carroll now. So forgive me, but it's hard to say that when he was just a kid when I met him. About 10 years ago, he began volunteering with the Cherokee Nation. He had a true passion for the anthropological interface with the botany and the botanical world around us, and he left the tribe and became very well educated at Berkeley, which we did forgive him for, and I urge you all to forgive him for. But he knows more about the interface between we people and plants than most folks, and I urge you to listen to him. And his talk is fairly deep and will have meanings on quite a few different levels. So I hope you take the time to think about what he says, because he's a very intelligent individual and much smarter than I. So to no further ado, Dr. Clint Carroll.
Well, Pat. Let me see if I can get this working again. Here we go. Osioni gadawo. Clint Carroll dawa dogi lisigat. De lasi digega awatansano. Nowo digadeo hanski. University of Minnesota digadeo hansko. Ahan gedo di danteti jigadana teska I jano seti. Jidedo ha gali liga. And I just want to thank my friend Wyman Kirk for helping me with that introduction. Although any butchering of the language is entirely my fault. So. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. In fact, I'm very humbled and honored to be asked to give a keynote talk so early in my career, and in a context that means so much to me. Since I do research here in the Cherokee Nation, I always hope that my work will be interesting and hopefully useful to fellow Cherokees. But I'd like to say right up front that rather than a lecture, I hope you'll consider my talk more starting a conversation. Considering some of you may be wondering what a guy from Texas and who lives in Minnesota has to say about traditional knowledge and the environment of the Cherokee Nation. But this is a topic that I've talked to many folks around here about, and when I spent a lot of time thinking about myself. As Pat said, from about 2004 to 2006, I spent the summers working for the Office of Environmental Programs. And my work involved interviewing folks about their knowledge of plants and developing an ethnobotanical database for the Cherokee Nation. And the goal of this database was to inform our environmental managers about sensitive habitats and areas of cultural significance to Cherokee people based on plant life. And this work is still ongoing. In 2008, I did my dissertation fieldwork on environmental governance, what I call environmental governance here, working with Cherokee communities and the Natural Resources Department. Since then, I've been back numerous times to continue this work with the support of a small group that has become known as Galangti Igatiha. It is both an advisory council to the Natural Resources Department and a focus group on the revitalization and perpetuation of Cherokee plant knowledge. The thoughts I present here are based on these experiences and my own further research and study. So I'd like to explain briefly the title of my talk. When I teach environmental issues in American Indian Studies, I like to emphasize that most Native peoples don't have much use for the concept of wilderness. By the simple fact that Native peoples, through their historical and contemporary reliance on natural products, have developed a pretty good understanding of the non-human world. Wilderness as a term comes across as a pretty hollow word. But in Cherokee we have the word inage, which roughly translates as wild, and I'm referring here to inage, ehisanki, wild onions, and other names of plants and animals. In my very limited study of the language, I've come to understand that inage is more a way of saying out there or not close to the house, right? And so when I say wild in the title, I'm thinking more in terms of inage. And so it's in this context that I'll present a few thoughts on what scholars now refer to as traditional environmental knowledge, but what our ancestors most likely knew as survival, right? But it was more than that, really. It was a way of life that involved acting right with the beings around you. But while the knowledge may have drifted out of use in the context of survival, in other words, we don't necessarily rely on this knowledge to survive nowadays, what with Walmarts and grocery stores, right? Many Cherokees would still consider it vital to a way of life, or an identity of what it means to be Cherokee. And I'm thinking in terms of gathering wild onions in the spring, huckleberries, crawdads in the summer, hickory nuts in the fall to make knutsy in the wintertime, that kind of thing. And that's why, to me, it's so important to talk about this knowledge today and to find ways to revitalize it, emphasizing the old ways and practices of our ancestors while finding new contexts in which the knowledge associated with those practices can be applied. And that is why it's also so important for us to protect and to reacquire the land and resources so that we can continue to maintain our relationships with those non-human beings around us and to honor the spirit of this land we live on, or in my case and many others, this land to which we return to visit family and friends and thus renew our connections to the nation. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to act like this man here, Iron Eyes Cody, and cry when we see litter on the side of the road, right? But on a very basic level, caring for the land means tending to our own identity as Cherokee people and making sure that it is there for our future generations. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important things we can do right now. But I'd like to go back to a concept that I mentioned just a second ago, honoring the spirit of the land. This is something that an elder said to me a couple years back in the course of my work here, and it stuck with me. In the context of the work that I do, it always amazes me to think about how we got where we are today. And now there may seem an obvious answer to that, the forced relocation that we all know as the Trail of Tears. But it's more about how we've adapted and innovated so much along the way. We've managed to hold on to our identity as a people and as a nation despite not being in our homelands. And I think that this fact brings up a lot of issues around what we call indigeneity. The term indigenous most often conveys being the first or original inhabitants of a particular place. But we are not the original peoples of this particular place. Most of our ancestors were relocated here against their will. Yet, are we not indigenous people? Of course we are. I think it is vitally important that we continue to emphasize this fact, especially in the face of some of our good old Oklahoma senators who have tried to claim otherwise. But as we all know, being indigenous comes with responsibilities. And some of these responsibilities are best expressed in our relationships to the non-human world. And this is where that phrase, to honor the spirit of the land, comes in. In the process of maintaining an indigenous identity, our ancestors established new relationships to place. In doing so, they took on and passed on to us the responsibility to act as caretakers of this new place they found themselves in. And this topic is what I want to elaborate on for a bit. What does it mean to establish relationships to a place? Some scholars have proposed that we think about this in terms of cultural landscapes. And in a nutshell, cultural landscapes are geographic areas of cultural significance to a particular people. The term is often used to describe landscapes that a cultural group has imbued with meaning based on historical experiences. And in the case of many American Indian peoples, these experiences are often of a spiritual nature. On a very broad level, we could view the hills and hollers of the Cherokee Nation as a cultural landscape. And those of you from Marble City would recognize this picture. This is Marble City Hill. And it's a photo that I took that I think, at least the best one that I have. I'm sure if I got up to some of the high points around Adair County, I'd be able to take a better one of the rolling hills. But y'all know what I'm talking about with the eastern parts of the Cherokee Nation. So on this very broad level, we can view this landscape, these rolling hills, as a cultural landscape. But when our Cherokee people first arrived in this place, they settled mostly in these eastern hilly parts that look similar to the lands back east. They were reluctant to leave that familiar landscape, and so the flat prairie lands to the west were sparsely settled at first. And this is a painting by Tracy Rabbit that's always kind of taken me as another example of that cultural landscape. You know, this painting of those hills and what is obviously Oklahoma. The title is From Tears Come Joy, and it's a very beautiful painting. This map here, a very rudimentary map that I composed using some data from I think it was the EPA, but it's just to show what we already know, really. This blue circle, the blue circle inside this red area is the historic area of most of our Cherokee villages in the southeast. And you'll see the ecoregions that are shaded in here with green, yellow, and a dark green. And if you look over where we are today in the Cherokee Nation, it'll show you with that blue shaded region in the eastern part and the dark green shaded region, that's the Ozark foothills and the Boston Mountains. And that's just to show, once again, what we're all familiar with is this area here, this cutout to the east that represents that portion of the nation that we know. Cultural landscapes are often reinforced and given context through storytelling. And we have a very significant story like this here in the Cherokee Nation although I'm not sure how much is being told today. Most of us are familiar with the origin of disease in medicine. If you were here watching that video before, they told a short version of it. And this was recorded by the anthropologist James Mooney, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's the one where the animals decide to take revenge on the human beings for killing them indiscriminately. The animals create diseases and inflict the human beings, but the plants come to the humans' rescue, and they create the many medicines that we know today, right? But there is another story, and it tells of how we came to know the medicines here in this land. And this story that I'm going to present to you it's written down in what are called the Doris Duke Papers of the Oklahoma Historical Society. And it was a project to document Indian oral histories throughout Oklahoma. Interviews from this project were conducted in the 1960s, and most of the interviews were Indian people themselves. In the case of this story that I'm going to present, our elder Crosland Smith was the interviewer, although he was only about 37 years old at the time. He has graciously lent us his voice for this story, and if you don't mind, I'd like to take a few minutes to listen to it. Let me make sure the volume is up. Okay.
From memory.
All right, here we go.
Mr. Silk told this story from memory. It is the story that took place shortly after the Cherokee arrived in the new territory. And the location of this event is somewhere between Bell Community and the Arkansas state line. On one of the peaks, the high points, the event came about due to the sickness that was existing in the Cherokee Nation. In this particular village of the Cherokees, after the forced march from North Carolina, the leaders of this particular village decided that they should try to pray to that they might be able to receive guidance from God. They chose, as I said, one of the highest peaks to perform their ritual. They stretched out a deerskin. Upon the deerskin, they placed their most sacred tobacco, which is known as the old tobacco. In a true sense, that tobacco is really the Creator's medicine. No one can do any better on that medicine, tobacco, than what the Creator did. It is already medicine. They did the ritual over the tobacco in the best way they knew how, as well as the deerskin, and began to smoke their peace pipe and sent the white smoke to the heavens. I might relate at this time that unfortunately the smoking is not the original intent of the use of the sacred Creator's medicine. It was designed to be offered to all the good things in life and offer it back to the Creator who produced this plant. This was a message to God. They were in dire need of His guidance at this time. Amidst their turmoil and their problems, the only one they could remember for assistance was God. After some time of performing their ritual, I would say half of the evening, 2 hours or so, they began to hear winds, far away winds, as if a low thunder and tornado was coming their way. But the sound was so far away that it was doubtful that they were going to get anything that night. To their surprise, the noise grew louder and louder, and seemingly it came closer and closer to them. They did not see a thing, but just before the noise was about to fall upon them, silence fell over the atmosphere, and then a voice from the air asked the people, "What do you want? What may I do for you?" They said, "We ask for you because there is sickness in our village, lack of food. The children and the orphan children are crying for their mother and their father. And all in all, we are experiencing the most difficult times of our lives. For this we ask you for guidance." This was the answer that the Cherokee people, the medicine man, gave to the voice in the air. The voice in the air then returned their answer and said, "All you have to do is look at the earth, look at the trees, look at the grass, and all the plants that I have placed upon the planet. You will find the medicine if you look." Again, I will repeat, look to the earth, look to the grass, and the trees, and all the plants I have placed on this planet. You will find your medicine there. This was the answer that God gave to his people. Then the 7 wise men went back to the people. They could see medicine everywhere. They looked all along the way. This is the medicine Indian people are using today. Not Indian people in one location, but Indian people all throughout the Cherokee Nation.
And so, not only does this story recount the receiving of knowledge directly from the Creator, but telling the story itself is an act of establishing a cultural landscape. And in this context, we might think about establishing, this is just a thought that I had, Workman Mountain near Bell Community, highest point within the Cherokee Nation boundaries, as a Cherokee historical site. Just an idea that I want to put out there. It's not on tribal land, I don't think, but we may be able to work out an agreement or consider reacquiring it. In any case, this story tells us one way our ancestors developed environmental knowledge here in the Western lands. But there are many others, and the following is what I've come across in my studies on Cherokee ethnobotany. Cherokee people learn directly from the Creator, as in the story just told. They learn by extended observation, and in this category, we need to account for the experiences of the old settlers. Their date of occupancy here is much earlier than 1839. Some say in the early 1700s, other historians say more like 1782. But within this category, we can deduce that Cherokees learned through correlation and experimentation, working with similar species from back east that they found here in the Western lands. And that they learned from the animals. And I'm speaking here in terms of not only watching animals in their physical form, where they go to heal themselves, where they go to eat certain plants, but also their spiritual forms as well. Now you might ask, what about learning from the people who were originally of these lands? Well, in this case, we have to remember that they weren't necessarily friendly with us, considering that we were moving onto their lands. The old settlers fought with the Quapaws and the Osages from 1805 to 1807 about the use and settlement of this land. The U.S. government attempted to regulate the relations between the groups, but this was mostly unsuccessful. In October of 1818, a treaty was signed between the old settlers and the Osages. But the Osages later abandoned the agreement because of the increasing amount of Cherokees and other Indians, like relocated Shawnees, Delawares, Oneidas, moving into the area. Warfare between these parties continued until around 1824, and so I kind of tend to think that such tensions between Cherokees and the Quapaws and Osages most likely precluded any exchange of local environmental knowledge. But that's just a theory. Anyway, getting back to the topic at hand, the Little People have also helped Cherokees with identifying medicines, and many say they are the keepers of the medicines. There are also stories of individuals taking seeds of medicine plants with them on the trail, or even prophetic holy people planting them in the western lands in advance of the forced relocation. And on a broader level, survival depended on a working knowledge of the land after the trail and even after the Civil War. And this involved adapting practices from the east to the new lands in the west. For example, using ancestral skills for fashioning clothes, tools, and weapons from strictly natural materials. They also set light fires in the forests and fields, which accomplished numerous things. It opened up the forest by freeing it of underbrush, and this aided in human mobility through the woods and allowed for better visibility while hunting. It generated fresh growth in the meadows and fields, which in turn attracted game to come forage in those sites. And so thus the practice simultaneously encouraged a healthy population of game and aided humans in hunting them for subsistence to eat. The use of fire also made gathering forest resources easier. So setting frequent, light, controlled fires cleared understory species that could otherwise prevent easy access to berry bushes and nuts. And in the Cherokee case, this benefited both humans and their livestock, since domesticated animals were generally what we call now free range, right? And on a personal note, it's an interesting story. One of my family names, going back on my dad's side, is hog shooter. They say "Sikwa ni yo ha," and that, you know, I've been when I first heard about that, I thought, okay, what is that getting at in terms of where that name comes from? And back in the day, of course, because of this free-range practices, the person that was in charge of going to get the hog, shoot the hog, had a very prominent responsibility for the community. And so I thought that was interesting, just on that note. So under these conditions, berry bushes thrived. The light fires kept fungus and insect pests at bay and stimulated the production of fruits. And yet another reason, which we are all very familiar with here, was to control the undesirable tick and sugar population. Lastly, fire was also used to clear fields for farming. Large trees in a field plot were girdled. Bark around them was cut completely off, left to dry out, and then burned. And to give you a sense of what this landscape was like, I want to briefly read another account from a similar historical project called the Indian Pioneer Papers. And they were before the story that we heard Crosland recount. They were performed, I think, in the 1930s. And this is a quote from a Mr. E.F. Van, who was born in 1870. He made this statement in 1938. He said, "The country of the Cherokee Nation was thinly populated and wild game was abundant. In the Flint district and in surrounding districts, except in the clearings which were being tilled, the country was still in its original condition. A hill country of forest with small areas of prairie scattered through it. It seemed the entire country abounded in wild game, deer, bear, possum, raccoon, wild hogs, wild cattle, wild horses, bobcats, squirrels, rabbits, wild turkey, quail, prairie chickens, and wild pigeons. All species of saltwater fish were abundant in the creeks and rivers. Wild bees were common, and the Indians could have plenty of honey by cutting down a bee tree and robbing the bees of their treasure. Each fall, many nuts were gathered, such as pecans, walnuts, hazelnuts, and chinkapins, as well as hickory nuts. Some orchards were planted, but not many, because there were plenty of wild fruits and berries such as plums, grapes, seedling peaches, dewberries, huckleberries, and a number of others. And so even if we account for a slight tinge of nostalgia there in this reminiscence, there are many other similar statements in this collection, in this historical collection, that paint a very consistent picture of this landscape, what it was like back even before the Civil War, but even after the Civil War. And Dr. Albert Varhoftig, an anthropologist who did work here in the 1960s, has written, quote, "Cherokees say that when they first came to the area, the Ozark Forest had trees so big and so widely spaced that through them you could see a man on horseback a quarter mile away." And if you think about that today, it's just almost, it kind of makes you think what it was like. And this photo here, a geographer by the name of Leslie Hughes from, I believe he was at OU, maybe OSU, came and did work here in the 1940s, and he took some pictures of that time. I don't know if you can see it very well. He claimed that this photo here showed possible remnants of pre-statehood environmental conditions, although with the level of brush that we see there, I'm just thinking about ticks and chiggers when I see that. So remember that the fire suppression policy, which I'll go into later, the history of that, had been in effect for many years when this photo was taken. So if you can imagine this a little bit lower, the brush there, but those trees being widely spaced, I think that's what he's talking about. And this next photo is one he took of an old farm, and what's interesting about this is when I mentioned the girdled trees, you can see them standing here. Those are girdled, dried out trees there in the cornfield. And that's from the Jenkins Creek area in Adair County. Altogether, the development and adaptation of environmental knowledge through all of the above means has inscribed a Cherokee identity onto these lands. Yet today, many folks I've spoken with about this subject cannot help but feel that this type of knowledge is not being passed down as it once was. In the case of plant knowledge, an elder and friend of mine once explained it this way. He drew a large circle in the dirt where we were sitting, about 2 feet in diameter, that represented the entire body of Cherokee plant knowledge, or all that has ever been known. And then he drew a very small cutout of that, about 1 inch in diameter, and said it represented what we know now. How did we get here? How is it that we find this intricate knowledge declining so rapidly? I believe that the history of the decline of our environmental knowledge is inextricably tied to the history of human-caused environmental degradation. And in our case, this happened as a result of the forces of colonialism. I make this point because in some of the conversations I've had with folks around here who are concerned about these issues, they seem to put an undue amount of blame on Cherokee people themselves for the loss of this knowledge. But I'm saying here that we can't blame ourselves entirely. There are many other forces at play. And some of these forces I'd like to go into. For one, the destruction of forests caused by the railroad and timber industries after the Civil War. And so the Treaty of 1866 opened up the Cherokee Nation to railroad companies, and with them came the intensive resource exploitation and settler encroachment. In 1871, railroad tie cutting began in the northeastern part of the nation. Mainly post oak was harvested for this purpose. However, the industry soon realized the abundance of quality timber for export and convinced some local Cherokees to sell stands of old-growth black walnut. So if you think about it, the railroad industry both required and facilitated large-scale timber exploitation. Although the Cherokee Nation passed laws to inhibit the sale of hardwood timber, they were ultimately ineffective. And so the forces of capitalism through timber export and colonialism through settler and railroad encroachment had created circumstances that were changing the land and Cherokee's relationship to it. The railroad and timber industries, working in concert with each other, marked the onset of the Industrial Revolution in the Indian Territory. A different kind of fire emerged on the Cherokee landscape during this time. High-intensity, stand-replacing fires accompanied logging activity, as felled areas were often burned to prepare them for grazing livestock. Also, sparks from passing locomotives could ignite exposed, dry, clear-cut areas. And these activities changed the character and composition of the Ozark forest by eliminating old-growth hardwoods and pines. Large fields eventually replaced many of the park-like expanses of forests that had once defined the Cherokee Ozarks. And when I say park-like, I'm talking about that quote where he was saying people could see a man on horseback a quarter mile away through the forest. The disturbance also drastically affected important forest resources such as huckleberry bushes. Next, the Cherokee Nation witnessed environmental changes that were put in motion by the Allotment Act and Oklahoma statehood. And these changes led to restricted access to natural resources through, like you see here in this map, checkerboarded landscapes. You know, using the grid system to determine who got what plot, right? And a proliferation of fences after that. Like I mentioned before, fire suppression policies, official fire suppression policies, began with the BIA takeover of Indian forests through the Omnibus Bill of 1910, and were later reinforced by the U.S. Forest Service Smokey the Bear campaign. According to this new management regime, the key to ensuring the availability of timber was the suppression of fire. Whereas this position was primarily aimed at eliminating catastrophic industrial fires like the ones caused by the railroad industry, all forest fires were judged to be a threat to valuable, quote, national resources, right? The combination of clear-cut logging, catastrophic fires, and the elimination of controlled small fires caused significant environmental changes in the western Ozarks that impeded Cherokee access to natural resources. The buildup of underbrush that accompanied the second growth forest decreased the ease of hunting and gathering by obstructing formerly open forests and providing ample habitat for pests like ticks and chiggers, right? Wild game populations likely diminished as a result of fire suppression, and that's combined with an increased human population. And once again, we all know how just the thought alone of ticks and chiggers is a deterrent to getting out in the woods sometimes, right? After Oklahoma statehood in 1907, increased state infiltration of the former tribal land base imposed new laws and jurisdiction upon Cherokee people, including land use and hunting restrictions. Hog fencing laws ended those open range practices, and non-Indians began to erect fences on former resource gathering areas. The Great Depression in the 1930s, along with severe droughts in 1935, 1936, made matters worse. While the restrictions to forest resources increased, so did Cherokee's reliance upon them. And during this time, I want to quote Dr. Varhoftig again, the anthropologist, and he's written that Cherokees were increasingly blocked from their generalized utilization of the woods and streams, deprived of sufficient cash supplement to capitalize even a subsistence farm, and confined to the tiny island of their allotments. He said Cherokee self-sufficiency had seriously declined by the time World War II arrived. In addition to this, in the 1960s, numerous lakes were formed throughout northeastern Oklahoma in the former lands of the Cherokee Nation. In the name of energy development and the newly minted term for our land, green country. You all know what, that term being used. It came about in the 1960s. Entire communities were relocated, and family and community cemeteries had to be excavated and moved. And this just gives you a sense. These maps here, once again, the one on the left showing you what it looks like, the river systems, the hydrology of the Cherokee Nation area before the lakes were formed. The one on the right shows you a kind of a current view of that with the lakes that we have today. And lastly, the creation of parks and reserves throughout the region limited human activity on the land. So all of this, combined with the slow integration of our communities into a wage economy and the reliance upon other ways of survival, that is to say, not living off the land, has led to the limited use of our environmental knowledge. But knowledge is a living thing. It must be practiced in order to stay alive. One of our elders related our situation to the properties of water. He said, we all know what happens to standing water. It grows algae and becomes dirty, unhealthy to drink. But running water runs clear, clean, purifies the mind and body. So if we all just sit still and do nothing, the knowledge will become like standing water and will not be used. But if we are active and if we make a difference, we will have health and clarity for the future. And I'm paraphrasing. I think the analogy of running water is especially fitting because of its significance to a Cherokee worldview. Just like knowledge, bodies of running water are viewed as living things. The respectful term for a river is Yanwikanahid, or long person, in contrast to ponds which have no inherent life force. And so while I want to stress that the decline of this knowledge was caused by many forces beyond our control, the revitalization of this knowledge is in our hands alone. The same individual who compared knowledge to running water stressed that using the plants honors the knowledge given to us by the Creator. If we don't use this knowledge, it will go away, and what will we have to say for ourselves? Of course, the situation is not hopeless. And this is where it gets kind of more cheerful. As a nation, we have done very significant work since the 1970s, when our Cherokee Nation government was revitalized. We've established environmental offices and programs which have led to the gaining some sense of control over our lands that have been diminished significantly. The recent development of cultural forestry programs by the Natural Resources Department are notable. And these photos here are from myself and Natural Resources staff, Pat Gwynn, Mark Dunham, planting ginseng up north. This is a 2-year-old root, I think? Yes. Okay. And then these bottom photos are the sprouts. On the left, you have ginseng sprouts, came up the following year. On the right, you have a golden seal sprout. I think Tony and Kara might go into this later, but they have quite a symbiotic relationship. They grow well next to each other. Ginseng is one of our 7 most sacred plants. And it's often viewed by Cherokee healers as a cure-all. Most botanists will say that it doesn't grow in these parts and never has, but many of our elders know that it can be found if you know where to look for it. Regardless, it is only very sparsely available, and so this was the motivation for procuring some 2-year-old roots from back east and attempting to plant them here in the Cherokee Nation. And I like to speculate that ginseng was one of those plants that was transported by those prophetic holy people, medicine people, before the trail. And in thinking about this in somewhat of a poetic light, I guess, metaphorically, roots are the stuff of cultural or social grounding in a place. You know, to say you have roots in a place conveys that you have connections, social connections to a place. And so in the act of transporting roots, it not only established important medicines, it established a cultural connection to the land. And I'm referring here to that term, cultural landscape, again. This is the cover of a small booklet that was published out of the Natural Resources Department with the support of the focus group that I mentioned earlier. And it's intended to revitalize interest in our plant knowledge. The booklet presents only some basic cultural information on a handful of local plants because it remains that this knowledge is highly guarded. And of course, this is due to the history of both ridicule and exploitation of this knowledge, which is something I didn't mention before, but it's an equally significant factor when thinking about the forces that contributed to the loss of this knowledge. The work of the Cherokee Native Art and Plant Society is also notable, and these are just a few photos from the Phoenix that highlight some of the work of this organization. I know they've been working towards creating mentorships between elders and youth on how to harvest and work with plant materials for basket weavings, among other things. Additionally, recent work being done with the immersion school is worth highlighting. This is a photo which is also from the Phoenix of Ryan Mackey teaching some youth about traditional gardening practices. And you'll forgive me if I left anyone out. This is what I've just been able to gather from my own ongoing interest in this subject on what people are doing in the communities and otherwise with regards to this type of issue, this type of subject. But there is still much work to be done. Of course, we must continue to support initiatives that seek to revitalize interest in teaching and learning about this knowledge and the land-based practices that accompany it. Further, the loss of the knowledge is directly related to the amount of space we have to practice it. So we're talking about land consolidation, buying back land and putting it aside for those by those who would teach and practice the knowledge we have left. There's also the possibility of using what are called conservation easements and land trusts. These are policy mechanisms that provide tax incentives for private landowners to leave their land undeveloped and to allow the access to and use of these lands by native people, local native people. Conservation easements operate under the principle that when you have a piece of property, you own a piece of property, that property right has multiple, the rights you have in that are numerous. We refer to them as a bundle of sticks. You can separate those rights when you have a piece of property. And the right to put developments on the land is one stick in that bundle of sticks. A conservation easement is when a landowner sells or donates that right to develop their land, and they give that right away in perpetuity. So the land remains strictly for conservation use only. A conservation easement is when a landowner, and land trusts are one type of entity that can hold conservation easements. If we go even further into that term, conservation easement, a cultural conservation easement is the history of conservation has not been very nice to indigenous peoples. Often it involved kicking native peoples off the land in order to make a park for citizens at large, or general citizens, right? Cultural conservation easement is a new form that is being used by native peoples that recognizes the sustainable cultural uses of resources on the land. And many native groups today are organizing their own land trusts to hold such easements, right? And in some states, tribal nations can hold the easements. In other cases, numerous tribal nations or communities have come together to create a single land trust for their shared goals. And so regardless of how it's done, with the economy and budget being as it is today, I would strongly suggest that we look into this method of regaining access to our lands here. And a great resource for this was written by a colleague of mine, Beth Rose Middleton. It's called Trust in the Land, New Directions in Tribal Conservation. My goal for this talk has been to highlight the fact that our relationship to this place is extremely significant and that we indeed still have a lot to lose. And the best way we can continue to honor the spirit of this land is to continue to uphold this relationship through teaching, learning, and practicing the knowledge we've been given. Doing this requires space. Taking care of the land in the way our elders know how is linked to our ability to access it and to use it. A leader in tribal environmental issues who has worked with Cherokee people here in Oklahoma, he once said that Cherokees had told him the ultimate goal, and I'm saying just a few Cherokees, that the ultimate goal was to go back east to the homelands. And based on the work that I've done, I wondered about this comment. It seemed to say that anything we do here is just for the short term. And so after thinking about it for a while, I realized I disagreed. I've hoped to emphasize in my talk today the extent of our relationship to this land, as well as the forces that inhibit our ability to maintain that relationship. While maintaining our relationships with the homeland is still very important, I've hoped to say that identifying and overcoming these inhibiting forces and focusing our energy on what we have here is critical. As Cherokees, it may be the most important thing we can do today. Wadon. Yes.
The Nature Conservancy is not Native American. Is there any way that the Cherokee Nation can work with them in saving native plants and so forth?
Is Pat Gwynn still here? Okay. I can speak a little bit on that. I know the Nature Conservancy. I've been there, and I've been there with Pat and Mark. And there is a working relationship. I think traditionally, and I'm speaking traditionally, meaning historically, land trusts like the Nature Conservancy have actually not been very conducive to working with tribes on these issues, and that's based on the work that was done in the book that I mentioned. However, relationships are always on a person-to-person basis, and like I said, we've had some relationship with them. I don't know if they would be amenable to working with the Cherokee Nation on that. They are a land trust, and so they would be able to hold such conservation easements. However, if it doesn't, if it's not working out, the alternate route, and actually the one that I might recommend over that is developing a Cherokee land trust and basically doing it ourselves. But of course that takes a lot of work and it takes some dedicated individuals. Thank you. That's a good question.
They have been doing some burning.
Have they?
Yeah, in the last several years, alternating different areas, and I own some land right next to it. In fact, I used to own the land that they now have, and then my husband sold it to John Nichols, who gave it to the Nature Conservancy. So my heart is there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that when I started thinking about this, they came up in my mind as someone to work with. Just because they're already there and they're already established, and they're quite a large organization.
Large tract.
Yep, and it's also nationwide too. I mean, the Nature Conservancy is all over. So yeah, I mean that might be a good first step. Yes.
You mentioned your colleague trusting the land in directions and tribal conservation. Where is her work? Is it available online anywhere?
Indeed, yeah, it is. You could find it on Amazon.com. And it's I wrote a review for it. It's a really well-written, practical guide. It's not only a guide. It's a good academic work. So it's got some real intense history on the history of conservation in the U.S. and what that means in terms of where we are now with conservation easements. But it also has an element to it that is significant because it's really useful for people that want to do this type of work in their communities and native communities. So it's at the same time as being a good academic piece, it's also a really good handbook on how to do this stuff.
And I was able to get her first name.
Yeah. Here we go. Beth Rose Middleton. Yes.
You mentioned the history of using plants for survival, and I just have a perspective of the American healthcare system about to implode on itself, and wonder if you foresee any bridging with health services and the use of medicinal plants, not only in hospitals, but in treating outpatients and eliminating, if not alleviating, the overuse of chemical products.
Well, one of the things that the folks that I've worked with in the course of 8 years that I've been doing this have stressed to me is that emphasizing traditional medicines, and I think I'm getting at exactly what you're saying, doesn't rule out Western medicine altogether. And so I think my answer to your question would be yes, there are definitely, it would require establishing those relationships, and I think to a certain degree they may be there, but they still need to be fostered and developed in terms of recognizing both systems in order to address a specific ailment. I think it's that the Navajo Nation, they have, in certain areas, tribal clinics have a very real good working relationship with their traditional healers, and it might be something that we consider working on here. But you'd have to talk to those healers here, and also to the medical doctors as well, and just get people together, right?
I think the conservation aspect and hanging on to the land is an excellent point too, because this is becoming a $3 billion industry. Mm-hmm. And as soon as corporate America learns that that's what people will buy, or that will become part of healthcare, then I worry that it will be exploited. And so I think the concept of trying to build it and keep it sacred is very key to its survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Along those lines, do you work at all with some of the issues nowadays around people trying to, pharmaceutical companies specifically, trying to patent some of the properties and qualities that are within sort of indigenous and traditional plants that
Yeah, that's a risk. It's always a risk. The tribes in the plains area up north never really got any credit for echinacea, and that's used all throughout. But the idea of extracting a pure molecule and then putting it on the market for sale as a piece of property by a drug company, for example, it is a huge issue, and it's something that we've run into, an issue that we've run into with regards to the very slow steps that we're taking to get some of this information out for revitalization purposes. It's a catch-22 or a double-edged sword, because the moment you put something out there, whether or not it's copyrighted or all the restrictions you can put on it, you run that risk of having that knowledge in some way exploited. A couple of the things that we've decided as a group, the group that supported the publication of this booklet, was that only the very basic information would be relayed in the book. Right? Only the bottom tier, elementary stuff would be given. Another thing was that one of the perspectives of the group members was that anyone who decided to take this knowledge and turn it around for personal gain, that stuff is going to come back on them. In terms of the legal world, a lawyer might look at you and shake their head, but in terms of the Cherokee world, I think that has a lot of significance. Yeah. Wade, did you have
Are there also efforts being done to preserve our animal life? Like when I was a kid, my grandpa used to talk about that they would fish for clittig in the creeks up in Jay area. And of course now because of the dams, they can't come up into the creeks anymore. And also, like for shell carvers, because they're trying to reestablish that, and reintroduction or the growth of the mankind pearl mussel, and there will be a need for that, if that art form is ever to grow. And so, is there also the efforts to manage those resources?
I would defer that to our Natural Resources Office, but I think it's a comment that I've gotten in the past. We tend to focus real heavily on our plants, and I think in terms of focusing on animals, that they tend to get not ignored, but certainly not focused on nearly as much as the plant knowledge that's easier to find, locate, and they stay in place, basically. But as far as, Mark, did you want to make a comment on any kind of conservation programs or plans that have more to do with wildlife than has to do with plants?
No, you pretty much covered it.
Okay. All right. Well, I would just say that whereas I didn't mention animals a lot in my presentation today, they're always a part of the discussion. And when we talk about land, and that's why for me it's the most important thing, because when you do talk about land, you're talking about everything that's on that land, And so it's something that I think in the future we ought to focus in on more. But as far as plans and conservation plans, I haven't seen a whole lot. We do have, I should say, and I think I forgot here to mention the Cherokee Nation equivalent of an endangered species list. And any citizen can petition to have a species, whether it be plant or animal, listed on that list. And all it does is go through a board review process with the Environmental Protection Commission. I think the bear, brown bear, or is it black bear? Excuse me, black bear and the mountain lion are listed on that list. And if you wanted to make a petition, you might get in touch with Pat or Mark at Natural Resources. Consider that. Yes, sir.
Hi, Clint. I know that slavery and private property are due to sin. And I studied the Word of God, the Bible, and I've noticed that in the Bible it says that only God owns the land, that people are nothing but caretakers of the land. And, of course, we know that because of sin or disobedience, now we have taxation on the land, which is totally abnormal. And up there where I'm at, I live in Adair County, close to the Arkansas border, up around Nycud, which there's a lot of Cherokee Nation land. But you get these people who've never even seen the land, but they'll buy thousands and thousands of acres, and they've never even stepped foot on the land. They've never worked it properly. And I think the problem that we're in is because we were never entitled to own a piece of land on a piece of paper. The only right you have to land is if you're going to go out and sweat and dig a hole and plant a tree or plant a garden or build a house or manufacture something on that land. That's called possession. You're entitled to possess that piece of ground, but it's going to require your blood, sweat, and tears to do it. And I think why, especially the Indian peoples specifically, are in the trouble that they're in is because the legal system has counterfeited themselves to where you can throw a bunch of money at a situation and get ownership on a piece of paper without working for it. And it was never the common law or the right way to do things with the earth, because we're not entitled to say, I own anything. But we are entitled to live and sustain an existence. And what troubles me is there's enough land in this world for everybody if people would humble themselves and live a moderate life. And, the worst restaurant in the world for Cherokee people is McDonald's, man. I mean, the reason most of our sicknesses come from what we eat. We eat all that junk. And that's why we have to use synthetic drugs. But if you live properly, if you work properly, if you live off the ground and you become a person of the earth, that's what the Cherokee person is, you can live to be 100 years old without any physical defects. And I'll close with this because I don't want to take the whole experience here. Diabetes is running rampant within the Cherokee people. Why? Because they're eating the white man's food. He's killing you, man, with that white flour, that white sugar. And genetically, the body's not made up to survive with that poison because white flour is a poison. White sugar is a poison. And they sell that stuff randomly. If they looked at it logically, that would be a criminal offense. They should throw these corporations in jail for what they do. So I'll close with that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that generally it all comes back to, for me, when it comes back to land, it comes back to having a space in order to continue those practices. And we may not get rid of all the McDonald's, and we may not want to, but at the same time, if we start emphasizing those other ways and those other practices, it's all connected, when you talk about sicknesses and like you mentioned, diabetes, and those comments have come up in the course of my work. Other tribes have been engaging in projects where they start from the concept of first foods, and many of these initiatives are not just health-based, but they're environment-based, and so health, environment, knowledge, all that stuff, it's really intertwined. Anybody else? Yes. Hi, Mavani.
I saw it funny when you just allowed us to the hall, fence and
Uh-huh.
stuff. Well, my grandfather, that did affect him, but it's not very much. Our neighbor bought a big tract of land that's behind her up to the lot line. And he bought 3 miles to the right fish and hunt all the time. But the comment he made was, he said, I knew I was going to keep him out of there, so I put gates up for him to go through instead of tearing my fence.
Anybody else have a comment or a question? Yes, ma'am.
If you notice the age level of the people in this room, we are concerned about the future. The key to this is that we need to share this knowledge with them.
Right. Yeah. Another comment that I've come across a lot in the course of my work. And I tried to emphasize some of the work that's being done with the immersion school. That booklet that I just briefly flashed up on the screen that was used as a textbook or as a supplementary text in the immersion school. And granted, it's a book, and we can't learn all that stuff from a book, but it's a first step, right? I have a grand idea, and it may be in a long-term goal. It's in conjunction with John Ross, who's put forward a proposal a long time ago about having a national park with the Cherokee Nation. And if we could develop or build a school in the woods, so to speak, I'm envisioning something that schools could come on field trips. And in the case of what I'm thinking about, it would be 100% eco-friendly buildings. So they have a certification system for how things are built, the amount of materials they use, and where those materials come from. Anyway, I won't go into detail, but it gets at what you're talking about. Is that's the most important thing. Is we can talk all we want about it as adults, but we really need to get the children interested. Not only expose them to the knowledge, but they have to have their own interest in it. And there's no other way we can do that but to revitalize it or increase this awareness of it, that it's here and that it's a heritage that we can't let go. So thank you. Yeah. Yes.
What about approaching from a conservation perspective of historic preservation where you declare areas traditional local property because of the plant resources that are there, and if they're eligible for the national register, not necessarily listed, but that would afford them some protection.
Right. Yeah. That is something that, it shocked me. Richard, we don't have a national historic preservation officer, do we?
No, we don't have a tribal historic preservation officer. This is something that has been discussed. I function primarily as a NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection Repatriation Act, and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act contract for the tribe. But my dealings are primarily with those states from whence we came because of the remains that are still there. One of the things that probably needs to be done is along those lines, and one of these days I'll probably have to take it upon myself to do that because it's not been done, and the tribe in the past hasn't been willing to put money into it because it would require a full staffing. And primarily starting with probably an archaeologist, but we'd have to look at what we're spending on archaeologists at this point in time with roads and with housing, because they all have to have a Section 106 survey done. We've got a lot of things that we do across the nation that can be done by other such things. Just to give you an example of what you've been talking about is Julia Coates got an email the other day that I responded to. She forwarded it to me, or it was forwarded to us, I don't recall, but from an entity inviting her to a gathering in Colorado, and that was featuring Grandma Ridley, Cherokee shaman, that
I addressed primarily, the woman was from Texas, and she's been appointed chief by a group down here, or a shaman. But what I determined from that is the person who responded to us saying that she was a fraud was a biochemist, and ultimately what I know he is interested in is the chemicals that can be found in plants, which he always before in fact, my email to him, I included whatever it is for the chemical phyllodoxin or something to that effect. The chemical found in mayapple, which is used for treatment of cancer, chemotherapy. And I came across that as a result of my brother, who was 28 at the time. He would have been, I think, 56 now, had cancer. And I went to Crosland and I asked him, if you were going to treat this, what would you use? And he brought me these plants. He said, boil this in tea and let him drink that. If it's not too late, we should be okay. And he was already under all kinds of chemotherapy, but he said the Cherokee name, and then he said it's known as mayapple. And it was maybe a couple months later, I was reading something, and in that article, it was they talked about extracting the chemical from mayapple for chemotherapy. So I know our medicine people knew a lot. I grew up going to, there were 5 in my community when I grew up, and I grew up at a bridge. There are no more medicine people out there anymore. They've become a rare commodity, and even with the emergency school, I mean, it's good to keep these children about it or make them aware, but we grew up doing those things. We grew up catching crawfish. We grew up hunting and fishing and gathering. We knew what to do. That was how we supplemented our diets. I mean, we weren't rich people. We weren't going back in. We didn't have, the money. People didn't have the money to go to the grocery store. We raised our own stuff. We raised chickens. We raised hogs. You talk about hog shoes. That was my responsibility. I used to shoot those hogs. And you have to know how to shoot them just right. Otherwise, they run around going crazy. It sounds funny, but it's really not, because it hurts you to kill an animal like that, particularly one that's pinned up. But we did it for survival.
Yeah. Yes, Wayne?
I was just, I think another issue, one of the reasons why we can't access some of the places that we traditionally used to is because of Yonne folks that aren't originally from here, because always before, like even when I was a kid, there were certain places we would go to gather things, might have been on a Yonne farmer's land, but they were generationally from here, and so we kind of had an understanding, that we could use their land and we could go, as an example, up around Cherokee Ford, there's in Cayugas, there's a place where they traditionally would get their huckleberries, and we went there about 3 years ago, I guess, to pick, and we were picking on the road easement. We weren't even on property, and we were on the road easement, and this man came out, he had purchased the property, and he was really asking us questions, he was like, well, you're not supposed to be here, this is my land, I said, well, we're on the road, we're on the easement, and so we went back the next day to pick some more, and he had taken a weed eater and weed eated along all day, so that we couldn't go and pick it, and to me that's the problem, right? Yonne folks that come in from California and Kansas and places that don't know, and purchase our land because they think it's so keen, or whatever.
Green country.
And don't understand, and don't understand our use of it, and aren't willing to allow us to continue to use it.
Yeah, that's been going on for some time. You look back in these documents that a couple of them that I read from, and they were saying that back in the 30s, 60s and stuff. That trend of people that don't have those family connections, or not necessarily family connections, but people that you just know. They may not be Indian folks, but they know each other. You know each other, right? And I agree.
It doesn't happen just with people coming from out of state. It's been going on, like I say, for years.
Yeah.
Where we used to gather onions, I took my daughters there when they were about 9, 10, just to show them when we used to gather wild onions. And
it was down on land that used to belong to my grandmother, but where the railroad came through. And that was a good place to gather wild onions. The railroad ties were still in that old railroad track. And the ground was softer there where they built up the railroad so we could gather onions down there. There were trails that came through the woods. There were wagon roads through the woods. And I led them all the way from where my grandmother lived down through the hollow. We call it Locust Hollow. Showed them the caves down there. And then we got toward the end of the hollow where we gathered onions. Not only onions, but Shelley and I went down and grabbed all kinds of mushrooms one day, brought them home, and Mom said, these are good, these aren't. And it was kind of that way. But when we got to the end of the hollow, it had been all dozed down for cattle, and no more trails, no more wagon roads, no more wild onions. It belongs to a Cherokee now who wasn't from the community. You want to know who he was?
Yes, ma'am.
My name's Sue Thompson. I'm from the Cherokee Use of Fire. And I remember my brother Robert's right back there on the stick. My brother's back there. I got a kid, he's 50-something years old. That's his nickname. But anyway, we used to go all the time to our grandmother. If it wasn't for wild greens, I wouldn't be here. Fish, I wouldn't be here. Or mushrooms either. And I remember going down right behind where high school is, and used to get our sassafras tea there. Time to get it, we always got it there. And we also, I remember driving down that country road, that same road, and there'd be hippie chicks stuck on the tree trunk. And we'd stop and we'd ask, we'd stop and ask those people that own the places, may we have the mushrooms that's stuck on the tree? I said, sure, they probably didn't eat them, but yeah, we had all kinds of wishies and like the morels and things like that, which it was a summer thing that we did. I mean, it was, and I know names of a bunch of wild greens in Cherokee that Grandma taught us when we were growing up. So, and I mean, it's great to be, but see, we're not doing that now. So, that's what we need to do. Otherwise, we won't know. Like I was asking Dennis, I said, what's a ginseng in Cherokee? So there happened to be a guy sitting back there who wrote it down in Cherokee for me. So, those are great times. Like Richard and I, we grew up the same way. It's great that you grew up that way.
Right, yeah, it's a blessing.
Anytime I got a lost steam, Grandma always had snuff in her mouth. I mean, I walked out of bed and it was like my eye. with snuff, tobacco. Or twisted tobacco. Whatever was available. Oil oil, she called it. That was our medicine. I remember one time my brother had a bike hung on a tree. He knew that I was riding it. He went somewhere. I was trying to get that thing down. I got it down, and then I got poked right here in my leg with the clutch, not the clutch, but the pedal. And I know I needed to be going to Hastings, but we didn't go to Hastings. Grandma just wrapped it up and threw some stuff on it. Here I am. My leg's still good. I just thought I'd share that with you.
Well, don't. Okay.
Excuse me, with all of our thousands of acres of land that we trust of the land that the Cherokee Nation has, are we working with tax land on some of these right now? Would it be available for people, the citizens of the Cherokee Nation, to go and pick the huckleberries and do the things you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a real tough question. I mean, it's a good question. It's a complicated question because it's something that came up just yesterday in our conversation in terms of gathering access and permits. It's not something that's developed yet, but in what way are we going to instill or develop a conservation code for our own citizens where we have limited resources and a lot of people that want to use them, right?
We at one time sold wood in Adair County, wood, bundles of wood and things that was utilized in the wood. Delaware County and Adair County that looks like we could plant and bring those back in that you said that you brought back and got a root and plant some of those things on our farm.
We're definitely in conversation with them on that. Thank you. All right. Are we out of time, or should I think we have one more question?
I saw one hand over here.
Okay. All right. Yes.
I've been an officer of the Native American Student Association under OSU, and at the end of this past school year, we decided that we're going to spend some of our association's money on building a medicine library, and in order to educate, because we have the highest number of graduating Native Americans in the country, and so we decided that would be a really good way to spend not only our time but our money in order to educate natives and non-native students. And I was wondering if you have any resources, maybe we can have someone come up there and educate on gardening, agriculture, and the medicinal uses. So there are people that would be available to maybe go to the store and
I think come speak with me afterwards, and we can talk more about it. There's I'm sure we have some resources here, and then there's also, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of other initiatives that are similar. Up in Washington State, you should check out a documentary called The Teachings of the Tree People. They have a native plant garden there that was developed in coordination with an elder from one of the Salish-speaking tribes up there, I think. And anyway, it's a really good thing to look into as far as like how you could design something similar, but unique, right? So yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate it. It's been fun and nice conversation. Well done. Yes, you're welcome.
All right. I want to do this quickly. I'll tell you a little bit about tomorrow. How many of you plan to come tomorrow on a nature walk? We have 2 buses. We can take 60 people and numerous private vehicles if we need to. You'll be in the Hard Rock. One of the buses is from the Hard Rock. That'll be the party bus. So all you partiers, make sure you get on the right bus. We will leave in the morning at 9:30 from in front of this building. I'm old and I forget things, and probably half of you, I told we'd leave from in front of the restaurant and the gift shop. We will actually leave from in front of this building at 9:30 in the morning. Closed-toed shoes, long pants, long sleeves, deep woods off, anything else that you want. No rubber boots, cat marks save the mud. We'll suck those off, but just wear shoes that you don't mind if they get wet and muddy. Okay. I've got a few door prizes for the morning. This afternoon, the plans will be used as door prizes. You have to be here to get one, so hopefully everybody that got something this morning is here. Blaze Glory, Skylar Ratliff. I'm going to talk. I'll get you in the hand. Skylar Ratliff. Okay. Ethel Littlefield. Right here. Barbara McAllister. Judy Harrington. What happened? What's the deal over here?